Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Scherreik, and I'm the director of the Entrepreneurship Center here at Seton Hall University, and I'm also the moderator for the next panel, which is going to be super exciting. I'm here with Eliad Kimhy. He is the senior producer of the Malicious Life podcast. It is a fantastic podcast which examines many issues in cybersecurity, a lot of behind the scenes of what happens at companies like Yahoo and Google, and it is completely fascinating. And so today, Eliad is here to share some stories with you that will give you greater insights into the cybersecurity industry and will also entertain you and be absolutely fascinating. So welcome, Eliad.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Let's start by you telling us a little bit about the Malicious Life podcast, and also how did you get interested in cybersecurity and what's your background?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I mean, the Malicious Life podcast is something we developed at Cybereason, I think, out of just pure passion for the field. You know, I joined Cybereason about three or 4 years ago, working in marketing and content, and a lot of the stuff that we do is we do research. I was involved in editing the research and bringing it to sort of publication. And it was always interesting when we were looking at the stories as they unfold, these sort of security incidents that we were looking at. We always had this question sort of, you know, what was the history of this field? What did it look like? We always heard these things, you get anecdotes and little stories and little myths. But we thought somebody needed to do something to kind of look into those stories. And so we did, and that was sort of the beginning of Malicious Life. And yeah, a lot of fun creating this podcast. As for your second question, you know, big part of my connection into security is this podcast and sort of the understandings that came from. Actually, this is the first time we're going to do this talk about the history of cybersecurity, and I think a lot of sort of my connection to security comes through. That's actually part of the goal why I want to have this talk. Yes, if you want, I can just dive into it. Okay. So. Thank you, everybody, for joining. A history you never knew existed. Lessons from this cybersecurity's rich, untold history. This is, like I said, the first time that we've done this. And what I want to do today is I want to try and answer a question for you. And I know a lot of you are students, or so I've heard, and I know a lot of you are kind of coming into security. And my question today is, like, can we look at cybersecurity through the lens of history, going all the way back to the 70s, the 60s? Can we look at that and try and learn something about ourselves as security practitioners, right? What can we learn from this industry that we're working in, how it evolved? And I'll tell you a little bit about why I think this is a valuable lesson. This again relates to my story. As I kind of mentioned a little earlier, what I did when I joined Cybereason is I was doing both sort of the present and the past. I was editing and sort of actively involved in these new incidents that we were looking into and sort of writing them out. And we did this podcast, and I was actively involved in researching these stories from the history, from the past. You know, and as I did that, I think I kind of started connecting some of the dots, because when you look at this evolution, you start to see how these things are connected, and they're connected through humans, they're connected through human stories, they're connected by the motivations of these people. And it was interesting to see that and to make those connections, because it kind of helped me understand who I was in this community, or what it meant to me, or how to find my bearings in this community, because I was able to see sort of this whole thing spread before my eyes. So I think what I would like to try and do today is offer this, and you know, hopefully you're interested. Is we're going to look at two stories from the history of cybersecurity, and we're going to try and see if we can sort of understand these motivations through the lens of history, and understand our own motivations in relation to that. Maybe that could help us sort of key in. Because when I joined this industry at first, when I first started, I feel like maybe I was a stranger in a strange land. I came at it from the outside, like a lot of people are. But this was something, understanding these stories helped me sort of find my place. And so a little bit about me and the podcast. I'm Eliad Kimhy, and I produce this podcast called Malicious Life. Malicious Life is one of the sort of top iTunes podcasts in the technology category. Millions of downloads every year. And whenever we do these surveys to see who's listening, students are always between 10 and 15% of the audience. So I really hope this resonates with you. I really hope this is useful to you. Maybe we have some fans in the audience, I don't know. So that would be cool as well. And what we try to do with Malicious Life is we try to tell a story every episode. We do a bi-weekly episode, and we try to tell one story from the history of cybersecurity. And you know, every time those stories are human stories. That's the main thing that they have in common. The technology changes around us, around them, but the motivations seem to remain constant or relatively constant. And so I find that interesting. And so I want to try and dig into a story with you guys. So I brought my trusty time machine with me, courtesy of the BBC, I guess. I don't know if Doctor Who is still cool, but I hope so. It is to me. So the question is, where do we go, right? And if we're going to go back, I suggest we go back. We go all the way back, right? And if I ask anybody in the audience, where does cybersecurity start? What's the origin point? Then I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different answers, but I'm also sure that some of you would say the virus, right? The first virus, the sort of the original malware, when did that start? What was the first day? So what I had agreed with Susan is that she would be moderating the chat, and what I would ask you guys is to type in the chat, when do you think when was the first virus created? Was it 1949? 1971, 1984, 1989. Now, let me just say, like, I will be asking some questions throughout this to the audience. Those aren't rhetorical questions. I encourage you to, you know, answer these questions. I encourage you to sort of tell us what you think, and sort of hopefully this would be a discussion. So we're going to try and go look at what is the first virus, and I'm not going to tell you what the date is. I'm just going to whoosh with our time machine, and we're just going to talk about these dates one by one. So by process of elimination, you'll find out. So let's go back in time. 1989. Viruses are considered a myth. A man called Peter Norton famously said this quote: "Viruses are a myth, like alligators in the New York sewer system." If you knew who this man was, you would understand the irony, because about a year later, Peter Norton released or helped write one of the most popular antivirus software in its time, Norton Antivirus. So it's kind of a interesting statement, or at least attributed to him, this statement, right? But why was it? You know, why was it that it was considered a myth, or that this widespread quote is sort of attributed to him? What we have to understand is, back then, how data was being transferred. Because before the internet came into the scene, there weren't a lot of ways to spread information. So, you know, what this nice gentleman is holding in his hand is called a floppy disk. I shouldn't tell you, I'm sure most of you know, many of you know what this is. It is a relic, considered a relic today, but the deal was this. If you wanted to transfer data, you had to physically put it on a disk, you had to move it to somebody else's hands, and they had to load it on, right? You couldn't do it any other way. And this tells us a little bit about what viruses were back in that time, right? Because they had to be really, really intelligent. They had to be clever in order to survive. If you'd put a virus on your computer and it immediately deleted it, then it wouldn't go anywhere else, right? The other thing that we're learning is that viruses had a hard time spreading, right? They spread around by foot. This was actually had a funny name. It was called the sneaker net. And this is sort of predates the internet. People would transfer these things physically to one another. So it couldn't get far. And so maybe this is part of the reason why this notion existed, that they just didn't exist, that they're a myth. Like alligators in the sewer system, there wasn't a virus, but there actually were quite a lot of them around the time that Norton famously was quoted to say this. So I want to go back now 5 years from that quote and talk about something else. Alexander Dewdney, who was a writer in the Scientific American, he heard this story, this myth, this computer programmer fairy tale that was passed down from programmer to programmer. And basically the gist was this. In some military secret government lab, there were some computer scientists who were developing a sort of secret program, a computer virus. This virus kind of went out of control. It spread across the lab. It infected all of the devices, and there was no way to stop it. But then out of nowhere, some genius, brilliant scientist developed a similar program, also spreading through the network. And the sole purpose of that second program was to hunt the first one. It was also a virus, but it was the antivirus at the same time. And that was the myth that Alexander Dewdney had heard. It's quite a fantastical story, right? But it inspired him to do something. It inspired him to create a game called Core Wars. And we'll talk about that in a second. I just want to show you, like, you see the picture on the left is a bunch of very serious picture of a bunch of computer scientists from an ancient era. It's just so hard to find a dramatic photo because they're all just so proud of what they're doing. So I had to look through so many. They're just like posing for the camera. I thought that was really great. But there were very interesting times, and I think those people were very, very passionate about what they were doing. Back to our story. Dewdney was inspired by this idea of this fairy tale, this myth of two programs fighting it out. And so he created a computer game. It involved a coding language that he had created. And basically, you would create a program out of that coding language, and you would put it into the memory of the game. And those two programs would fight it out. He called it Core War. It was really interesting. He published that in the Scientific American. And what he was looking for is for people to send him their creations to see who would win this war. But what he got was much more interesting. And what he didn't expect was that a lot of people wrote him not about their submissions, but they wrote to him about viruses that were out there in the wild. And so a year later, he collected all of these stories and he wrote. And you can still find these publications out there. And he wrote this: when the column about Core War appeared last May, it had not occurred to me how serious a topic I was raising. My descriptions of machine language programs moving about in memory and trying to destroy each other struck a resonant chord. According to many readers whose stories I shall tell, there are abundant examples of worms, viruses, and other software creatures living in every conceivable computing environment. Some of the possibilities are so horrifying that I hesitate to set them down at all. Alexander Dewdney found all of these examples of viruses and worms that he had not thought existed. that he had considered a complete myth. But he was interested, he published it, and I think what's interesting, if you read the actual column, you see that he even publishes the code to some of these viruses. And I think what's interesting about that is he saw it as an experiment almost, right? It was interesting to him. It wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something to experiment with. But this story, this myth that he was talking about, it was real, and it actually happened in 1971. So by the way, that's the correct answer. So we're going to whoosh back in time to the 1971. And as we do the whooshing, I want you to think about the evolution, of this industry. And this is one of those questions that I want to bring up. As you think about what we did and where we went with so far, sort of going backwards in time. When you think about where we are today, I want you to think about the evolution of the perception of what malware is, right? We know today that malware is considered a threat, and we know it has been for a long time. If you go back to the late 80s, though, it's considered a myth, right? If you go back even further, it's an experiment. And if we go back now to the early 70s, then we'll see what it was considered back then. But it was interesting, I think, to see, because these are, again, recurring themes, right? If somebody tells you something is impossible, sooner or later, that's gonna break somehow. I also think it's worth noting the attitudes of the people who are kind of looking into those things. Some were uninterested, some were more exploratory, some were kind of looking into it. Some thought there was a myth and didn't think about it any longer. So I think it's important to also look at that. And I'm kind of interested in your thoughts, and you can comment, and which side of history would you be on? Would you be exploring, or would you be accepting things as they are? And what are your thoughts about this whole thing? We're going to go back, and we're going to tell the real story, the true story of the first virus. 1971, BNB Labs. And if you know the name, it's because this is a very famous facility, operated, I think, started in the 1940s, 50s. And this is where, pioneers were working. And this is truly groundbreaking work that was done at BNB Labs. This is a civilian company, civilian lab that was working for the military. So not a secret government facility, but maybe something a little more mundane. These sort of pioneers were working on the ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And they were the people who developed the email, the internet, all those things. And I want you to think about that as well. Like, what would it feel like to work somewhere like that, right? What did these people do? What were their motivations when they were coming into work every day? And I want to just kind of like remind you guys, this is the decade. At the end of the decade, these were the pop culture influences, right? All of the sci-fi that we know and love today. Look at the computers that they were using. Look at the representation of the potential. And these people who were working at BNB Labs were kind of making that a reality in some senses. So that sense of inspiration, kind of keep that in mind as we go through the story. Our story begins with Bob Thomas. He was the creator of the first virus. Bob was looking for a solution to a problem. Bob's problem was that, especially with these old systems, applications would fail. And when applications fail, if you work for the military, you don't want anything to fail. So Bob was thinking, how can I solve this problem? And then he became curious, what if I could write a software? What if I could write a program that duplicates itself without alerting the user? Well, then I can create a backup while you're working, and if something fails, I can load the backup. So he ran a test. And the test was, he wrote a program that was self-replicating. It would jump from one computer to another, it would delete the old file, and would just keep jumping from one computer to another within the network, just to see how it would work. But But Bob didn't end things there, because he added a little something to this to his code. Maybe in a moment of mischief, he made this software do something funny. It printed a message on the screen. I'm the creeper, catch me if you can. And that was the birth of the first virus. The creeper, that's how it got its name, basically jumped from computer to computer within the lab and put the message up to any terminal that it was found itself on. And this was the test, and the test was successful. Sort of what he was testing ended up being implemented in some software or in some of the early programs. But that wasn't sort of the end of the story, right? Because there's a challenge here. Catch me if you can. And it turned out that somebody took on the challenge. Now, I don't know if Bob let his creeper loose in the lab and just like wreak havoc like the myth was saying, or if it was conducted in a controlled environment. But what I do know is that Ray Tomlinson, who's one of the pioneers in this lab, he's actually the person who's credited with creating the email. He found out about the creeper, and he took that challenge to heart. Right? And he thought, okay, what can I do? How can I catch the creeper? So he wrote his own self-replicating program, and that self-replicating program jumped from computer to computer, and it deleted the creeper wherever it found it. Right, and so that's the true story. That's the story of the creeper and the reaper, and that's the story behind the myth. And this is the myth that inspired the game Core Wars, and this is the myth that sort of we didn't think was possible up until 30 years ago. Before the internet came around and sort of gave these viruses and these things sort of a way to become more real and more threatening. Why am I telling you all of this? And I hope this story was interesting, sort of fascinating on its own, right? The idea of how this sort of progressed and where we are today. But I want to focus on the motivations of these people, how they got to where they got, and how this brings us to where we are, right? I told you I'd be talking about people. And when I first read this story, it seemed like the distant past, right? But it took me a while to understand that actually these are things that are running parallel throughout the history to things that are happening today. There are pioneers today working on things that they are driven by this sense of curiosity. They're driven by this sense of pioneering, exploration. And my message to you is to maybe try and find what inspires you. Find out what it is that keeps you curious, because this is something that's so prevalent in the industry, and I've found to be so resonant within the industry. So if you can find that, maybe that's something that could keep you grounded in sort of the industry. Yeah, I want to pause here, Susan. Is there anything, any questions, any comments, anything?
We haven't had any yet, but I'd like to ask the audience if you have any questions at all for Eliad. That would be great. That's a fantastic story. And Eliad, when we were speaking, you said that what really drives people with viruses and what really drives the industry is a passion to solve problems, or as you showed, a passion to create problems.
Yeah.
So, right? So could you tell us a little bit about that tension? Who are the good guys in cybersecurity? Who are the bad guys? And as you said, it all comes down to human motivation. And we've heard throughout the conference today, people talking about, well, you can learn the technology here, but it's really all about people, and you've got to keep, in fact, Sam Curry, your boss, who gave our keynote address, was saying that what we always have to keep in mind are the bad guys or the wrongdoers we are chasing are men and women. And it's also men and women who are working in the companies, Yahoo, Google, the stories you've told. So what's the tension here? And how does that grab people who want to work in cybersecurity on the right side?
It's an amazing question, I think, and because the line is very thin. I mean, this is a slide I was going to have in here anyway, but I think it's kind of appropriate for this because the motivations that we look at and we see kind of popping up throughout the shows, they're not exclusive to one side or another, right? The passion, the thirst for knowledge, greed, and willing, or the sort of needing to impact the world or explore or do something, those aren't exclusive to one side. And I think the sort of distinction between the two sides become clearer and clearer towards sort of as they tease out. But when you look at sort of people and how they're motivated, the root of how they're motivated, the motivations can seem very similar. When you look at curiosity, we have a lot of stories of people who were curious and ended up on the wrong side of the law. A good example is the young man called Mafia Boy, Michael Cersei, I think. And he basically created, in the late 90s, I believe, created a major DDoS attack on Yahoo and a bunch of big websites. He was curious. He was looking for knowledge and experimenting, and he ended up causing a lot of damage. And the next story I'm going to tell is also a pretty good example of sort of how people cross the line unwillingly. But yeah, does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, and we actually have a question. We have a question from the audience, which pertains to both your stories. What is the research process for decades-old stories like this?
Well, there's a lot more information on the internet than you might expect. For example, in researching this story, I went on actually the Scientific American's website. They have archives. You can look at the stories on their archives. You can read the columns. You have people who are historians who are writing about these things. You would find it in books. Everything is pretty much online. My next story, for example, I had to research with Wayback Machine while like looking for forum posts and things like that. So that's part of the process. You just look for any bit of information you can find, and then the human element is really, really important. We've made some really great connections along the years with people like Graham Cluley and other people who are just there, and Sam as well is a frequent guest. And those people then tell us, like, for example, Ron Levy, the host of the podcast, had a conversation with Bob Thomas, and they were kind of going back and forth over email, and that's how we kind of tease out these stories. But a lot of the information is out there for those who look. Should I kind of continue?
Yes, we'd love to hear your next story. And I'd also like to point out that one thing we've heard throughout this conference is that our experts have been advising students to get knowledge on cybersecurity outside of the courses they take, and in many different ways. And I think I would highly recommend the Malicious Life podcast as a way to get information. I mean, you delve into, it seems to me, in so many ways, what goes on in big companies, and sometimes how they're very open about getting hit by hackers, and other times they're not so open. So what I heard in your first story and what I've heard on your incredible podcast is that there seems to be a level of not accepting always the reality of what hackers are doing, which can't bode well for us as consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And in this next story, you actually see a rare case where the leaders of the company actually go to the community and ask for help. And I think that tension is very interesting and rarely sort of comes up. But yeah, we were talking about curiosity. We were talking about thirst for knowledge, greed. There's a lot of motivations in security, and curiosity is not only one. And I hope by telling these stories and by kind of learning a little bit about the correlation between past and present, this could be helpful for people to kind of find what they love about security. And when you talk about love, they say, they say that love makes us do stupid things. And I guess my next story is a little bit about that.
Okay, and Eliad, before we go in, we do have another question that relates to the present and maybe the future, and that we have a student who's saying, how have organizations in different industries ramped up their cybersecurity efforts, especially during the pandemic? We have seen a wide variety of ransomware, phishing, and other cyber-based attacks. Why cybersecurity awareness for employees is essential. What other tools, ways are being used?
Yes, I saw this question in the forum, I think, before the talk, and I tried to answer it as best I could, and I'll try to answer it now. I don't want to give an incomplete answer. I'm not the ultimate security researcher or ultimate expert in this category specifically. But I think we live in a really interesting time. Historically, I don't think we've seen anything quite like this. And I think it's interesting when you look back through time to see how security went from these closed labs, in 1971, where only a select few could work on these, through, the development of ARPANET, and then 20 years later, when the internet came around and slowly people began to approach this. The next story I'm going to tell is about a young man who sort of gets into this field at a very young age. So as we kind of grow, as the history kind of progresses, this becomes more available. Now we find ourselves in a position where it also needs to become remote. And so I think it's an interesting evolution. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in my research. As far as what companies are doing, I mean, I think anecdotally, I know that some companies are getting hit harder than they used to. Some companies are getting hit less than they used to, and we don't quite know why that is. And again, I don't want to speak as if I'm the expert on this, but we think maybe it has to do with sort of now that with the impact of this the COVID-19, maybe sort of the priorities shifted a little bit. Maybe lower hanging fruits are in different places than they used to. So it's sort of a question that we need to try and answer. As for the tools, I mean, I work for an EDR company, and I absolutely would recommend an EDR, next gen antivirus. All of these acronyms are important, and I would say that especially a solution that is able to work or to provide protection while you're offline, that is highly important, because when you deal with something like a ransomware, that's not going to wait until you're on the network, or that's just going to detonate. So when you have some powerful prevention, some powerful next-gen AV, I think this is a good thing to have while you're dealing with ransomware during a pandemic when you're out of the office. That would be my answer.
Great, thanks. And now we're waiting for your next story,
Okay.
because it's all fascinating.
Thank you.
It's fairy tales for 2020.
Yeah, hopefully we can make new myths for people to spread around in their work environment. So hopefully we can support them with facts as well. So we're back in our time machine. I want to take you now 20 years back. And I said my story is about love, and it is about that. It is about passion. But I want to note we're going 20 years back in time, as opposed to 50 years back in time. And I want you guys to keep that in mind, right? We're much, much closer to where we are today. And the hero of this story, or the villain of this story, is not a computer scientist anymore. He's not working in a lab. He's not even considered an adult. He's not even allowed to drink, actually. 17-year-old Axel Gamby woke up one morning to find SWAT teams, German SWAT teams, outside of his house. With guns pointing at his face, basically. He was allowed one cigarette before he was taken away. And I want to make sure before I start this isn't a cautionary tale. I'm not going to tell you something scary. This is exactly what we were talking about It's important to understand the human motivations behind the people who are on the other side of the fence. It's important to understand how they think, or how we all think, and what we all have in common. So don't look at this as a cautionary tale. But in order to explain how Axel got into this predicament, we need to go a little bit back. You know, Axel's story begins in 2003. Axel is a young man with little on his mind except for school and computer games and a hobby that he picked up. This hobby is hacking. And like a lot of us, cybersecurity comes to a lot of us in a lot of different ways. And for Axel Gamby, he got hacked. And he was looking to find out what that was. And so he kept learning more and more, and he became a hacker through that at the age of 17. And for Gamby, these two passions of his, the video games and the hacking, will collide in a fantastic way later on in the story. Because Gamby was a fan of another thing. He was a fan of a game called HalfLife. And some of you who know this game kind of know where this story is going, but to those who don't, HalfLife was a sort of a masterpiece. HalfLife 2 as well was sort of considered a masterpiece in this sort of medium of video games. And this game was being developed for a very, very long time. Highly anticipated, 5 years in the making. It was actually delayed for 1 year. So you can expect that somebody like Gamby was highly anticipating this game to come out. 6 years, 5 years, that's a long time for a 17-year-old. But Gamby thought, like, okay, maybe there's something. Is there anything I could do? Maybe he got a little curious. Can I find a way to look at this game? So 6 months later, HalfLife 2 leaks onto the internet. 5 years of work basically vanishes, or basically gets leaked out completely for free for anybody to look at. How did this happen? Why would Gamby, who was a fan of this series, why would he try to hurt the people that had created this game? Well, it turned out he didn't. He didn't want to do any of that. And so to explain that, let me just explain that a little bit. On October 2nd, 2003, the head of the company who makes HalfLife, Gabe Newell, reached out directly to the community. He said, I need the assistance of the community. This isn't the cybersecurity community, by the way. This is the HalfLife community, the fans, the big fan base for this game. And he said, quite emotionally, right? If you ever had one of those weeks, right? This is just not my day. This hasn't been the best couple of days for us. Source code was leaked. He then specifies how it happened. And at the end, he says, well, this sucks. What I'd appreciate is the assistance of the community. And he goes on to say, we at Valve have always thought of ourselves as being a part of the community, and I can't imagine a better group of people to help us take care of this problem. Now, this created a huge discussion, and the responses came from everywhere, right? Most people were sympathetic with Valve, and most people were kind of really against the hackers and what they had done in leaking this game. Well, what's Gamby to do in this situation? So imagine a 17-year-old get himself into this, the center of this situation. Well, Gamby, I think, felt a little remorseful, maybe. In a very public way, in a very immediate way, he had to come to terms with what he had done. So the impact of what he had done just became very clear. And maybe it seemed inconsequential when he did it, but I think now the weight of it started bearing on him. So what did he do? I think he was feeling remorseful, and so he reached out to Gabe Newell. This is actual FBI documents from the case. And he writes, hello, Gabe. I am very sorry about what happened with HalfLife 2. I want to explain a few things. Yes, I'm the hacker. No, I did not distribute HalfLife 2. So the plot thickens, right? Gamby, I think, I can only guess, was fairly remorseful, and maybe was trying to get some justice. It turned out Gamby didn't distribute HalfLife, or at least according to Gamby. It turned out he was a part of a group. While he was spying on Gabe and the Valve team, somebody else was spying on Axel. And so Axel may have been the one breaking in, but he was also being targeted and spied on. And somebody else stole the source code or stole the credentials from him, and then leaked them out, which is terrible, probably for Gamby, because he never intended to do any of that, right? Maybe he only intended to just spy on his favorite computer game team, something he's really passionate about and he loves. He also gives Gabe advice. This is again from the FBI files. Get somebody that's dedicated to security, which is very generous, very magnanimous of him. And I want to kind of talk about this for a second, right? We said love makes you do stupid things, and I think it's really easy to look at this story at this point and say this is a stupid person, stupid young man, and maybe he is. But I want you to think about this young man and what could have been, right? If he hadn't made the mistakes that he made, what could have been his destiny, right? This is the whole idea of adversaries and motivations sort of leading us to having similar motivations, but sort of branching out to different places. You know, where could Axel Gamby have been if he hadn't tried this? Could have been a CISO today. Who knows? And it's important that we understand the same fact that they're not, our adversaries are not robots; they're human beings. So I'm going to pose this question, and feel free to answer it in the chat or ask yourselves: what did Gamby do next? Did he turn himself in? That's how he got caught. He asked for a job. Did he release another game? I'm going to answer this immediately because we don't have a lot of time. Axel Gamby asked for a job. In a strange twist, not sure what motivated that twist. Again, love, passion. Love might blind us to what might be the reality of our situation. He asked Gabe Newell for a job, and that was his downfall. There's not a lot of other things that connected him to this case, and Gabe immediately agreed. He got the FBI on the phone, and basically Axel Gamby nearly went to the United States seeking a job as a security person at the same company that he had hacked roughly 6 months earlier. And that's the end of the story. The German government, who'd heard about that, basically intervened, got Gamby first, and Gamby, who was young and sort of passionate, and had acted with pure naivety, I would say, was let off without a prison sentence, but he wasn't allowed to touch computers for a very, very, very long time. And in a recent interview, he expressed his remorse and sort of the idea that these people were his heroes, and all he wanted was just to get a closer look at his game, not to do anything more than that. So why tell you this story, right? Two things, right? The first thing is how rapidly things move in this field, right? 50 years ago, 1971, computers and networks were the sole domain of scientists. 20 years ago, it was something that was available to 17-year-olds who were hacking big companies. Today, this is something that a lot of people get into sort of intuitively in their own lives. So I want you to think about that. Second thing is, how can passion drive us? There's a lot of things I've learned to be passionate about through my work in security, playing chess, picking locks, understanding how malware works and what makes these things work, understanding the sort of dark underground that goes on behind the scenes. Find your passion and find out how this passion can drive us, can drive you, can drive the industry forward, And I know a lot of people in this industry started out like Gamby, but their passion led them to a more positive place, and it still leads them today. So I would say that that is the end of the talk, and I want to thank you, and I want to open this again for Susan if there's any questions or comments. But otherwise,
yes,
I just want to say thank you.
Eliad, that was absolutely fascinating, and I think a great point that you've got all these talented people who are involved, but what path and what route are they going to take in cybersecurity? And so that leads to another question. You discover shortcomings in a system. Sure, context and legality are important, but is the sandbox always correct?
Is the sandbox always correct?
Right. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I'm thinking that maybe despite legality, are the hackers the ones that really are correct? You know?
Not exactly. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how it was meant, but if it's meant in the sense that you know, if the question is if you find a vulnerability, should you report it? Should you take action to exploit it, or whatever? I mean, I think throughout the history, especially, you find a lot of people who pick option number A, or sorry, option A, and you find a lot of people who pick option B. A lot of people sort of choose to exploit. I think in the industry we have very well established disclosure practices, and I think it's only right that we stick to them in an effort to sort of prevent any further harm. I hope that answers the question. Maybe the person who asked it can clarify what they meant.
Yeah, and then I'm not so sure this is about cybersecurity or a Star Wars fan, but I will pose the question to you. Since it's really all about people, and since you've already made note of Star Wars, do you believe that you can objectively say that the rebels are wrong for going up against the Empire? Without people out there crossing lines, how do, you know, let me see, and that's where it ends. How, you know, I guess, what do we do without people crossing lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question of philosophy and sort of moral relativism, and I think if we go into that field, maybe you could make the argument that the rebels are the bad people in the story of Star Wars. Maybe they were infringing on some other people's rights. Not everything in life is as black and white as movies like Star Wars, like, you know, Star Trek, or all these movies would have us believe. And when you're a student of history, which I hesitate to call myself, I'm a fan of history, you come to realize that there's always a lot of gray areas that you need to explore in order to understand. There's a lot of really good people in the industry today that had started doing things that were less than appropriate, let's just say, and those people are doing a lot of good today.
Great.
You know, should they be called out for what they had done in the past? It's a philosophical question, but if your question is what are the motivations of other people, I don't know. You know, when you look at an APT, you look at a group like Chinese government-sponsored attackers. Certainly, they think that they're doing something great for their homeland, as do we, right? Where do we draw the line? That's a good question. But when you look at cyber criminals, where I think there's a lot of less of a gray area, because I think there the motivation might be different. You look at hacktivists, there's different. There's another gray area there. I think this is a question of philosophy and really depends on the case-by-case basis. But yeah, a lot of it we bring on the show, and not to plug the show, but just to.
So I would say to those who are asking these philosophical questions and others that your best recourse is to tune in to the Malicious Life podcast. Eliad was very kind to put the address, the connection, the link in the Whova app, so you can find it there. And Eliad, it's been a fascinating 50 minutes. We could listen to you all day, and we can if we just tune into your podcast. And so thank you so very, very much. Coming to us today from Berlin. And Eliad, it's been a great, great pleasure, and it's been an honor to have you involved in our cybersecurity conference. And now I'd like to tell everyone, you take a break at 1 p.m. We're having our second keynote speaker, Mike Garrity, who is the key cybersecurity person for the state of New Jersey, and he's going to give us a half-hour address, and then we're followed by a half-hour lunch break till at 2 o'clock we're having students and young employees come on to talk about their job experiences and internship experiences. So thank you, everyone. Eliad, it's been a great, great pleasure. We hope to invite you back, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much.